Hello, BookTube. Firstly, let's just apologize for a couple of things. The location here, which doesn't have the greatest light. Okay, I admit that. But this is about temperature. There's been a recent cold spell that's come to the UK, and myself and the person who watches television, we've taken a decision to not spend so much on our energy bills because energy bills are expensive. So we've decided that only certain rooms in our home are going to be heated. And the one I normally record in, well, that's one of those that we didn't consider essential, so we haven't heated it. Whereas this room, which quite clearly is the room that we sleep in, yeah, we want to heat that for obvious reasons. So the light isn't great in here because, we're usually sleeping in this room. Light is only necessary for finding your way around without stumbling on things in this room. But I need it for recording just now because it's a quiet place, because the person who watches television is watching television in the only other heated room, and I don't want to banish him from there because he's keeping warm as much as I am. So let's do our Middlemarch meditation. And starting out, I thought what I would put in the background here was a proper West Midlands landscape. I talked about it being wetter and less flat in the West Midlands than in the East Midlands. And this is a West Midlands landscape. So you can just see how much the ground moves up and down and just how richly green it is. Of course, this is probably summer rather than autumn. But if you could just imagine that with all the deciduous trees maybe starting to turn color, you'd get some idea of what it would have been like for Rosamond and Fred Vincy as they rode to Stone Court. Speaking of which, the last time we spoke, we left off at the end of a passive-aggressive conversation between Peter Featherstone, the patriarch of Stone Court, and his widowed sister, Jane. I'm going to say Wall. I think I was saying both Whale and Wall last video, and I will be honest, I haven't had a chance to check on YouTube as to what the prevalent pronunciation is. I'm going to say Wall. I'll continue to say that, but if anyone knows that I am definitely wrong and should be saying whale or some other pronunciation that hasn't occurred to me yet, by all means volunteer that information. It's not a problem. Okay, let's get into the reading. Now, if we remember from last time, Jane Wall was trying to get information out of her brother Peter about how he had made out his will, about who exactly was going to benefit. And she compared Peter with her other brother, Solomon, as you can see here on screen. She said that Solomon makes it no secret what he means to do, meaning he has made his last wishes clear. Peter thinks Solomon is a fool, in short, and we are left wondering, who is going to benefit from this will anyway? And then Fred and Rosamond turn up. And in novels, unlike in life, of course, nothing is ever random. We're certain that the whole point of this meeting is that we're going to hear more about this will and whether or not Fred Vincy has any part in it. Sorry, before we start where we left off at page 107, I actually need to go back. So if I scroll up here, you'll recall there was something that Jane Wall said that I didn't explain. And it starts in this paragraph that begins at the top of the screen here. Whether or no, brother, it is naturally painful to me and my brother Solomon to hear your name made free with, and your complaint being such as may carry you off sudden. That was her sort of hinting, you might not live long, and people who are no more Featherstones than the Merry Andrew at the fair. See, normally I'm fastidious about explaining all these little terms that are thrown in. I didn't explain this one. So let's do that. Let's talk about Merry Andrew. Now, the exact date of origin for this term, not certain. The Oxford English Dictionary cites literary mentions of Merry Andrew as early as 1680, and they're mentioned in connection with Bartholomew Fair, which was London's biggest outdoor summer fair. It was held annually for 700 years between 1133 and 1855 when it was stopped because the authorities felt that things were getting too chaotic. The interesting thing is in 2023, the City of London has revived the fair. And so if you're looking for a good time to visit London and see the revived Bartholomew Fair, that happens during the first 2 weeks of September. Now, Merry Andrew seems to have been a character actor who played the fool and had his own stage show running throughout the duration of the celebrations. Why Jane Wall chooses to say people who are no more Featherstones than the Merry Andrew at the fair, well, I suppose if she were a contemporary character, she might say people who are no more Featherstones than the Man in the Moon, something like that. When I was recording last week's video, it seemed to me that you would get the idea that she was trying to convey, but that's not always the point. Sometimes it's good to have the cultural context of what is this outdated term? Does it mean anything? Is it significant? And I love going down all those rabbit holes, and I think you do too. By the way, this is a chapbook that you see on screen now, an 18th century chapbook telling stories of the Merry Andrew. This is available on Project Gutenberg. Obviously, public domain text, it's that old, and it's just obviously humorous stories. They may have derived from Merry Andrew performances at the original Bartholomew Fairs. So I'm just posting it now in case anybody's interested in looking into that further. Okay, now let's go on where we left off last time. This paragraph at the bottom of page 107. Before Mr. Featherstone's cough was quiet, Rosamond entered, bearing up her riding habit with much grace. She bowed ceremoniously to Mrs. Wall, who said stiffly, "How do you do, miss?" smiled and nodded silently to Mary, and remained standing till the coughing should cease and allow her uncle to notice her. You might think, yeah, all right, this is a lot of description, but what it is saying, it's showing how well trained Rosamond is. This is what she would have learned at Mrs. Lemon's school. What do you do when you come into company? She needs to greet everyone in the room, but for the head of household, she needs to wait to be greeted. Regarding her riding habit, I think it's lovely that it should say here, bearing up her riding habit with much grace. Yes, because riding habits were beautiful garments, particularly in the time that we're looking at, which is the 1830s. I have got a lovely image for you. This is a fashion plate from the time showing a lady's riding habit, Kirka 1830. So this would have been the style. And you can see how beautiful it is. You can see how beautifully fitted the jacket is. And of course, there's the veil over the hat. She would have had all that stuff. You'll see as we read on that she's got the full kit. And it's a very beautiful garment, lots of cloth, very lovely. I could just imagine a character like Rosamond, who's clearly tall and very willowy in figure, is going to set off that garment really well. I should mention, I think everyone knows this, but I'll mention it anyway, because you hate to leave anything unmentioned. Rosamond would have been riding side saddle. It was not considered good form for a woman to straddle a horse's back. She needed to ride side saddle. She would have had a special saddle for this that would have been different than the saddles that you see now, which are made for the idea that you're going to have one leg on either side of the horse's body. This would not have been true. Rosamond would have had both legs on one side of the horse's body, and the saddle would have been designed so that she could drape her knees over the two protrusions on the saddle to help her stay stable while the horse was moving. And amazingly, if you have a good, well-fastened side saddle, if that makes any sense, you could go at a full gallop and do jumps, which it's amazing to me, but you will see in my description box a short video, which is lovely because it's made by English Heritage. And so it's set at a beautiful country house, and there's lovely music in the background, and it sounds like the beginning of a period drama. And sure enough, an actor in a later Victorian riding habit, which was much plainer than this one from the 1830s, but nevertheless illustrates how you can get onto your horse, side saddle, and then demonstrates just how much the horses can move freely, and you are still stable in your saddle. So if you want to go watch that, do, because I think it's charming. Even if you do know how to ride side saddle, it's charming to watch this little extract that looks as though it comes straight out of a BBC period drama. And that brings us to the top of page 108. So I'm just going to read the first couple of paragraphs and then we'll comment. Peter Featherstone has finally stopped coughing. So he's saying, "Heyday, miss," he said at last. "You have a fine colour. Where's Fred?" "Seeing about the horses. He will be in presently. Sit down, sit down. Mrs. Wall, you'd better go." Even those neighbours who had called Peter Featherstone an old fox, oh, so he has a reputation, they had never accused him of being insincerely polite, and his sister was quite used to the peculiar absence of ceremony with which he marked his sense of blood relationship. Indeed, she herself was accustomed to think that entire freedom from the necessity of behaving agreeably was included in the Almighty's intentions about families. She rose slowly, without any sign of resentment, and said in her usual muffled monotone — we know about this tone of voice already — "Brother, I hope the new doctor will be able to do something for you. Solomon says there's a great talk of his cleverness. I'm sure it's my wish you should be spared. And there's none more ready to nurse you than your own sister and your own nieces. If you'd only say the word. There's Rebecca and Joanna and Elizabeth, you know. I remember. You'll see I've remembered 'em all dark and ugly. They'd need some money, eh? There never was any beauty in the women of our family, but the Featherstones have always had some money, and the Walls too. Wall had money too. A warm man was Wall. Aye, money's a good egg, and if you've got money to leave behind you, lay it in a warm nest. Goodbye, Mrs. Wall." So I find this such an interesting passage, because I think what is being said here, exactly, a lot of things being hinted at. You just know there have been conversations before about all these issues, and Mr. Featherstone's just reminding her of things. I think he is saying, I have made some provision for your daughters, Jane. Don't be awful. I mean, it's terrible that he insults her daughters in front of Mary Garth and Rosamond Vincy, basically saying, well, they're a bunch of ugly girls. They'll need money because I won't be able to marry them off. I think that's what he's hinting at. But Mrs. Wall, he's also saying too that she really should have enough money, that her husband was wealthy, yes, and that maybe she isn't being truthful, being forthright about how much money she already has, that perhaps she's being greedy, hinting at that you've got enough money to leave your daughters, do you not? Because I remember Mr. Wall was a wealthy man, and maybe when he says money's a good egg, and if you've got money to leave behind you, lay it in a warm nest, maybe that warm nest is Jane Wall, his widow, that she knows how to hang on to money just as well as anybody does. That would strike me as being, well, everything that the narrator is using to characterize these people is giving me the feeling that if the Featherstones know anything, they know how to make money and they know how to hoard money. They definitely know those things, that money is a good egg. They gather it and they sit on it, like the dragon Smog in Tolkien's The Hobbit. That's what they do. Next section. Here, Mr. Featherstone pulled at both sides of his wig as if he wanted to deafen himself, and his sister went away ruminating on this oracular speech of his. Notwithstanding her jealousy of the Vincys and of Mary Garth, there remained as the nethermost sediment in her mental shallows. Oh, I love that phrase, the nethermost sediment in her mental shallows, a persuasion that her brother Peter Featherstone could never leave his chief property away from his blood relations. Else, why had the Almighty carried off his 2 wives, both childless, after he had gained so much by manganese? and things, manganese and things, turning up when nobody expected it. And why was there a Lowick parish church, and the Walls and Powderells all sitting in the same pew for generations, and the Featherstones' pew next to them, if, the Sunday after her brother Peter's death, everybody was to know that the property was gone out of the family? The human mind has at no period accepted a moral chaos, and so preposterous a result was not strictly conceivable. But we are frightened as much that is not strictly conceivable. When Fred came in, the old man eyed him with a peculiar twinkle, which the younger had often had reason to interpret as pride in the satisfactory details of his appearance. "You two misses go away," said Mr. Featherstone. "I want to speak to Fred." To my mind, he can't be speaking to Fred significantly for the very first time. We know that Fred has made frequent visits to Stone Court, but I'm thinking that what we're about to find out is that Fred Vincey and Peter Featherstone have some kind of long-standing, call it a relationship, call it a partnership, call it an understanding. I don't mean something romantic, obviously. I don't know what to name this yet. We're still finding out. Fred seems perfectly comfortable. Maybe he was even expecting to have some kind of private talk with his uncle. But that's not the only significant relationship. Listen to this. "Come into my room, Rosamond. You will not mind the cold for a little while," said Mary. The two girls had not only known each other in childhood, but had been at the same provincial school together, Mary as an articled pupil, so that they had many memories in common and liked very well to talk in private. Indeed, this tete-a-tete was one of Rosamond's objects in coming to Stone Court. I'm a little surprised, actually, to find that Rosamond and Mary have known each other for so long, given the way Rosamond spoke about Mary Garth in the previous chapter, as though she was a bare acquaintance, someone she didn't really know well. And yet it seems that she does know her quite well, that they both went to school together. In the 1830s, there was no uniform national system of education in England. Schools were all private businesses of one kind or another, many of them religious, as you can imagine, and parents all had to pay fees in order to have their children attend. That meant that you had to be fairly well off even to have your children go to school at all. And the narrator is letting us know that Mary Garth, yes, went to a private school, but she went as an articulated pupil, which means that she worked at the school in some capacity, free of charge, in order to pay for her education. Whereas, by contrast, it's clear that Rosamond Vincey would have had her fees paid. She didn't have to articulate. Mary didn't come from as well off a family. I almost feel that she's quite a frugal person naturally. When she says, "Come into my room, Rosamond, you will not mind the cold for a little while," suggests that not many rooms in Stone Court have a lit fire, and possibly that Mary did not have a fire lit in her room in the morning, which is typical. Normally, the first thing a servant will do in a better house is come in very early into their mistress's bedroom and make up a fire, such that the person getting out of bed doesn't have to get out into a freezing cold room. But it seems here as though Mary is saying that she doesn't have a fire, so perhaps she doesn't have one lit early in the morning. Perhaps she goes without that, which is quite austere. But she does seem to be a frugal type. I'll see if that bears out as we go on and read in the book. Old Featherstone would not begin the dialogue till the door had been closed. He continued to look at Fred with the same twinkle and with one of his habitual grimaces, alternately screwing and widening his mouth, and when he spoke it was in a low tone, which might have been taken for that of an informer ready to be bought off, rather than for the tone of an offended senior. He was not a man to feel any strong moral indignation, even on account of trespasses against himself. It was natural that others should want to get an advantage over him, but then he was a little too cunning for them. This is following up the previous mention, isn't it, that Featherstone has this reputation for being a cunning fox. perhaps what we're going to see now is a demonstration of that. I think we've seen a little demonstration already, but his sister seems to be easy to fool. She doesn't strike me as a person who really understands well how to get information that she wants, since she's using this sort of strange passive-aggressive thing, which I don't think is effective. Whereas I wonder if what Peter Featherston is going to demonstrate now is how to be very effective. Notice that also he waits before he speaks, not just waiting so that he knows that Rosamond and Mary have definitely left the room and will be out of earshot, but he allows a little time while his face is giving these contradictory expressions, a grimace with a twinkle in the eye. How would a person read that expression and know what was going to come next? Let's go on and see what he says. So, sir, you've been paying 10% for money which you promised to pay off by mortgaging my land when I'm dead and gone, eh? You put my life at a 12-month, say. But I can alter my will yet. I've actually made that speaking louder than he said. Actually, if I did it in the tone of voice that the narrator indicates, it should be sort of something like, so, sir, you've been paying 10% for money which you've promised to pay off by mortgaging my land when I'm dead and gone, eh? You put my life at 12-month, say? But I can alter my will yet. So he speaks in a very low, quiet tone. The aggression isn't there yet. I actually shouldn't have put the aggression in. And I think that's also genius of Featherston, because in this gentle, gentle voice, he is conveying some threat. I think that's very off-putting when you don't know. First of all, you don't know what's coming because of his mixed facial expressions, but also you don't know what is coming because his voice is low and gentle, like an informer ready to be bought off, and not an offended tone. So he's not speaking as though he's offended, and yet what he's saying, it's quite clear. To me, it's quite clear that he's saying, yeah, I am offended. And what are you going to do about it? Also, what's interesting is the detail that he gives. We remember the conversation with Jane Wall, where she hinted that Fred Vincy might have said something to the effect of, she was so vague. And I don't think that the details that Peter Featherston is now giving Fred Vincy, I don't think he got those from his sister, because she just doesn't strike me as a woman who's going to be direct and detailed. She's always trying to come at things from the side. She's trying not to be clear. That suggests that Featherston has another, better informer who's already given him all these details that his sister has merely hinted at. Now this scene at Stone Court is starting to take on the character of a spy story. How many informers might Peter Featherston have? And are they telling him the truth? Is he using this opportunity with Fred Vincy to test whether or not he is being told the truth? Let's read on. This is Fred's reaction. Fred blushed. He had not borrowed money in that way for excellent reasons, but he was conscious of having spoken with some confidence, and in brackets, perhaps with more than he exactly remembered, about his prospect of gaining Featherston's land as a future means of paying present debts. Now we, the reader, we have an advantage. We now know that Fred Vincy isn't exactly guilty of the crime Featherston is accusing him of, but we also know, so we know that he's not done something really stupid, because if he had borrowed money against the promise of an inheritance, that's a very stupid thing to do. But he's still been stupid in a lesser fashion, in that he's done what Peter Featherston would know better than to do himself. He's told other people his intentions. Fred has shared too much. He hasn't yet picked up the Peter Featherston technique for don't tell people too much. Keep some things to yourself. It's better that way. So perhaps again, Peter Featherston is just testing him to see if he's picking up any of the skills that you could imagine Mr. Featherston might want in a good heir, if that's what he's got in mind. And of course, we don't know. We need to keep reading to find out. And Fred here says, I don't know what you refer to, sir. I have certainly never borrowed any money on such an insecurity. Please to explain. Please to explain means, please could you tell me where you heard about this, or you say more. And Peter Featherstone's come back and said, no, sir, it's you must explain. I can alter my will, yet let me tell you, I'm of sound mind, can reckon compound interest in my head, and remember every fool's name as well as I could 20 years ago. What the deuce? I'm under 80. I say, you must contradict this story. Wow. Fred's been given orders. This isn't even a suggestion. This is an outright order. You must come up with an explanation for this. And Fred Vincy answers. He says, I have contradicted it, sir, Fred answered, with a touch of impatience, not remembering that his uncle did not verbally discriminate, contradicting from disproving, though no one was further from confounding the two ideas than old Featherstone, who often wondered that so many fools took his own assertions for proofs. But I contradict it again. The story is a silly lie. Nonsense. You must bring documents. It comes from authority. Now let's just rewind a little bit. Go back to the top of the page. When Fred says, I have contradicted it, what he means is, I am a gentleman, and a gentleman's word, apparently, in the 19th century, was supposed to carry weight, such that if you said it, it must be true. And Fred is relying on this convention of, if I say it's true and I'm a gentleman, then it is true. What he says, not remembering that his uncle did not verbally discriminate, contradicting from disproving, though no one was further from confounding the two ideas. In other words, Mr. Featherstone might not verbally make a distinction between just saying that something wasn't so and proving that something wasn't so. But the truth is, Peter Featherstone did know the difference, and he often wondered why on earth people took this gentleman's word to be meaningful at all. And yeah, I get that. No, it might be interesting, Peter Featherstone's reply, where he says, nonsense, you must bring documents. And why that spelling? I do think that is some kind of local accent that Eliot is trying to imitate with spelling. I don't know if that still would be true. I can't think that of a West Midlands accent where document would be said documents, unless it's to speed it up, perhaps. I don't know. The 1830s, there were a lot more regional accents because people did not move around as much. So you could get little pockets of pronunciation in certain areas. And she's perhaps thinking of somewhere around the town that she grew up in, perhaps thinking of how the word was said there, perhaps thinking of the way she says the word. Who knows? So Fred Vincy, still indignant, says, name the authority, and make him name the man of whom I borrowed the money, and then I can disprove the story. To which Featherstone says, it's a pretty good authority, I think. A man who knows most of what goes on in Middlemarch. It's that fine, religious, charitable uncle of yours. Come now. Here Mr. Featherstone had his peculiar inward shake, which signified merriment, so he can't laugh, but his whole body shakes. And Fred Vincy says, Mr. Bulstrode. And his uncle says, who else, eh? And Fred says, then the story has grown into this lie out of some sermonizing words he may have let fall about me. Do they pretend that he named the man who lent me money? And Featherstone said, if there is such a man, depend upon it, Bulstrode knows him. But supposing you only tried to get the money lent and didn't get it, Bulstrode would know that too. I've got to pronounce that correctly. Bulstrode would know that, meaning Bulstrode would know that too. You bring me a writing from Bulstrode to say he doesn't believe you've ever promised to pay your debts out of my land. Come now. Mr. Featherstone's face required its whole scale of grimaces as a muscular outlet to his silent triumph in the soundness of his faculties. As far as Peter Featherstone is concerned, he's got one over on Fred. He's got him backed into a corner and pinned down because Mr. Bulstrode's a banker. If there's been any money lent, he probably does know about it. But you'll also remember something from the previous conversation that Peter Featherstone had with Mrs. Wall. He gave the impression to his sister that he hardly knew, spoke to, or cared about Bulstrode, didn't he? When he mentioned, or no, she mentioned Bulstrode, and her brother said, "What's Bulstrode to me? I don't bank with him." And yet it's clear that Bulstrode is one of his informants. So it's someone, and maybe actually Featherstone does bank with him. That would be interesting. That just would fit so much with this whole cunning fox thing, is make people think you're not doing something and be doing it. Make people think you don't care about a certain person, but that's actually your chief informer. Yeah, that would be interesting. Fred felt himself to be in a disgusting dilemma. Interesting adjective, disgusting. Let's see why. "You must be joking, sir. Mr. Bulstrode, like other men, believes scores of things that are not true, and he has a prejudice against me. I could easily get him to write that he knew no facts in proof of the report you speak of, though it might lead to unpleasantness. But I could hardly ask him to write down what he believes or does not believe about me." Fred paused an instant and then added, in politic appeal to his uncle's vanity, "That is hardly a thing for a gentleman to ask." So this is what the substance of Fred's discomfort is. He's being asked to do something that a gentleman should never have to do, should never have to get someone else to swear that his own statements are true. He should be able to state that something is true and have it trusted and accepted as true. So what Mr. Featherstone is asking is humiliating. So the disgusting is not, it's not an inappropriate adjective. This is a humiliating thing to ask a gentleman to do, to lower himself, to ask a financial man to give him backing. But Fred is disappointed. If he's trying to appeal to his uncle's vanity, his uncle doesn't care. And we're going to just pause for a moment so I can bring the 2 pages up and we can read the whole of Peter Featherstone's speech. Let's go back now to the start of Peter Featherstone's reply. I know what you mean. You'd sooner offend me than Bulstrode." Okay, so he's saying, yeah, you're humiliated. Oh, poor you. Better that you not suffer and I suffer, not knowing whether you're telling me the truth or not. And what's he? In other words, what's Bulstrode? He's got no land hereabout that I ever heard tell of. A speculating fellow. There again, we've got some kind of accent that Eliot is trying to capture in by misspelling the word speculating. A speculating fellow. He may come down any day when the devil leaves off backing him. And that's what his religion means. He wants God Almighty to come in. That's nonsense. There's one thing I made out pretty clear when I used to go to church. Yeah, I can't imagine Peter Featherstone being a great haunter of churches. And this God Almighty sticks to the land. He promises land, and he gives land, and he makes chaps rich with corn and cattle. But you take the other side. You like Bulstrode and his speculation better than Featherstone and land. After Fred has protested that he's being humiliated, what Peter Featherstone is saying is, you are doing me the humiliation by preferring Mr. Bulstrode, who can give you nothing but I presume that Mr. Bulstrode plays the stock market, such as it was, or does some other kind of speculating. So he's using perhaps money with money, but doesn't own any land of his own. And Mr. Featherstone makes it perfectly clear that that one of the bases for his philosophy of how to be wealthy is land. Land, first and foremost. You get land, you get productive land. That's what you get. That's where wealth is based. And basically insulting Fred by saying, "Oh, you're more worried about offending Bulstrode. What can Bulstrode give you? I can give you land. I can give you the real basis, the dependable basis of wealth." Whereas he said, a speculating fellow may come down any day when the devil leaves off backing him. And poor Fred. Fred replies, "I beg your pardon, sir," said Fred, rising, standing with his back to the fire and beating his boot with his whip. "I like neither Bulstrode nor speculation." He spoke rather sulkily, feeling himself stalemated. Well, he is. He's in a position where there's nothing he can do now except agree to whatever Mr. Featherstone has offered. But it's interesting, he's beating his boot with his whip. If you go back to page 58 If you're reading the same Oxford Classics edition that we're looking at here, if you go back to page 58, you'll find that Sir James Chetham, poor Sir James, when Mrs. Cadwallader was announcing that Dorothea Brooke had become engaged to Mr. Casaubon, what did James do? He used his whip to beat his own boots. It's a nervous habit, which it seems that Fred Vincy also succumbs to when he's under stress. And Peter Featherston just comes back with another fantastic counterpoint. Well, you can do without me. That's pretty clear. In other words, saying, you want me dead as soon as you can get me dead because you need that money. So you can do without me, said old Featherston, secretly disliking the possibility that Fred would show himself at all independent, suggesting that their strange, whatever it is, partnership, I don't know what this is. This is something they've obviously decided to get together and act as father and son. That's what it seems to me. So he doesn't like the idea of Fred getting any independent ideas. You neither want a bit of land to make a squire of you instead of a starving person, nor lift of £100 by the way. It's all one to me. I can make 5 codicils if I like, and I shall keep my banknotes for a nest egg. It's all one to me. Better explain this. This is a lot of... Basically, he's saying to Fred, it seems to me that you're not interested in land because you're willing to sell it off to pay some gambling debts. And at the same time, you're not willing to just ask me, if you have a gambling debt, whether I'd lend you a bit of money to get you out of a tight spot. And he's saying, it's all one to me. I mean, he says, what difference does it make if I give you my land and you squander that? Or you just say to me, can I have £100? Which says that Featherston is saying, you and I have a kind of relationship where I would expect you to come to me if you were in a bit of trouble that way. I wouldn't expect you to say something behind my back as you have. I would expect some different behavior. And then he says, I can make 5 codicils if I like. Codicils are additions or amendments that you can make to a will without actually having to rewrite the entire will. And so it was handy if you wanted to suddenly make a slight adjustment to your last will and testament. So he's saying, I could make multiple different changes to my will, just saying, Fred, pay attention. I'm just saying I could change all kinds of things. And I could keep my banknotes as well for a nest egg. In other words, I've got a lot of money. It's all one to me. It's all the same wealth. And of course, this is so embarrassing to talk about. I can understand why Fred coloured again, as it says in the next paragraph. This is embarrassing. Featherston had rarely given him presents of money. Okay, rarely, but obviously it had happened. So again, that says something about the relationship between the two. And at this moment, it seemed almost harder to part with the immediate prospect of banknotes than with the more distant prospect of the land. Featherston's obviously saying to Fred, take your pick. You can have a bit of cash now to cover your debts, and you don't have to be my heir. I can work that out quickly with my lawyers. Or, yes, have the inheritance, but be a little respectful. Be a little respectful. If you value the wealth that I've built up from land, don't throw it away paying gambling debts. Be a bit more Featherston. I think is what he's trying to say. So Fred just has to completely back down. He has no other choice, and he does, quite nicely. I am not ungrateful, sir. I never meant to show disregard for any kind intentions you might have towards me. On the contrary, good. Now, that's what Peter Featherston wants to start with. But of course, he says, very good, then prove it. Okay? You bring me a letter from Bulstrode saying he doesn't believe you've been cracking and promising to pay your debts out of my land. And then, if there's any scrape you've got into, we'll see if I can back you a bit. Come now, that's a bargain. Here, give me your arm. I'll try and walk around the room. Such an interesting scene. I love the relationship between these two men who aren't related at all, except by, I think it's Mr. Featherston's second marriage happens. Very, very strange. And yet he's developed such an affection. He obviously sees something in Fred, but it's quite clear from this exchange that he doesn't think Fred is, what? Not perfect yet. So perhaps this whole conversation is a lesson to Fred Vincy in how to be more of a Featherston. First of all, shut up. Don't tell everybody, don't blab the way you obviously do blab. Secondly, think about the money and the wealth that you have and how you're going to use it. Don't throw away a piece of land to play a gambling debt. Better make sure you've got other sources of wealth. Make sure you've got other ways to pay that. Hang on to your land. It is the basis of wealth. It is the underpinning. You don't just sell that off willy-nilly. That is not what you do. So in these subtle ways, Peter Featherstone is trying to teach Fred Vinci the way he thinks about wealth, perhaps in the hope that Fred, and he must think Fred has some potential for this, Fred has the potential to do well. I'm less certain, but, the book is still young yet, isn't it? And we will need to come back and carry on somewhere under this blue line that I've drawn on page 111, which we will do. Maybe sooner than later. If anybody heard me mention about Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, I have now reached chapter 7, but I still have over 200 pages to read. So I literally have another novel left to read effectively in the last chapter of The Magic Mountain. And I do want to talk about that book this coming week. I hope to have something to say, but it's been such an immense reading journey that I think all I'm going to do is be giving you first impressions. But those might be good for anyone who's never read the book and is thinking, do I read it? Because I think there are some things one should definitely bear in mind before they tackle Thomas Mann. Yes, it is a great book. Yes, it is an important book. Nevertheless, it's 900 quite serious pages, and I will talk about that, but not here. Later. All right, everybody, thanks so much for joining this meditation, and hang around until the 3rd and 4th weeks of December, because what you'll get is another 2 back-to-back on successive Sundays. Okay, hope your reading's going well, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.